You're listening to Drop It Like It's Pop.
Drop it like it's pop. I'm Georgie Statius.
And I'm Vicken Karkukli. This is where two lovers of pop culture come together, unfiltered and unedited, to analyze the biggest stories, moments, and yes, controversies the world of pop has to offer from our very special point of view as media professionals and international event experts.
I'm the PR specialist.
And I'm the journalist.
Join us as we agree to disagree and talk pop till we drop. We're live. Well, we're not live.
We are live.
Well, we're live in people's ears. But here we are, episode 3.
Who would have thought? Episode 3.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. You're Vicken Karkukli from Louisville.
And you're Georgie Statius from Melbourne, Australia.
Apparently. We really need to tighten up these openings.
We certainly do. That's right. Well, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you. Here we are.
And we're doing a bit of a 180 with this one.
We are. Tell us more. Tell me more. What are we talking about in this episode?
Oh, so welcome everyone. This is Drop It Like It's Pop, episode 3. And obviously focusing on pop culture and the moments that pop culture create from your perspective as a PR specialist and from my perspective as a journalist. And we've also both worked in media operations at major events.
And we both love pop culture.
We absolutely do. And so we focused on two big moments for episode 1 and episode 2, which were Taylor's new album and Beyonce's new album. And this time we're going to talk about more of a concept than a person or a moment. We're going to talk about the concept of comedy and what we decided to call the injunction to laugh. That's quite a few layers there, which we're going to take some time to decipher. And I'm very excited about this. I mean, comedy has always been a huge topic in our conversations. So I'm happy to kind of share some of these topics with our lovely listeners. Thank you very much for tuning in to episodes 1 and 2. We hope you enjoy this one as well.
And of course, if this is your first time listening, we invite you to go back to 1 and 2, if you so choose. you might decide we're getting better as we go, or we're getting worse as we go.
I think you should, absolutely. I think you should. But before we get down to business, that business of comedy, we decided to bring in a new segment, which we're going to call About Last Time.
That's right, because we both realized, we probably realized after the first episode, but particularly after the last episode, that we made a few faux pas each. I'm sure we made, I'm sure I made quite a few faux pas, but we thought this can be a little segment where we maybe correct something that we said in the last podcast.
Yes, I have a couple of things to correct. Should I
crack on? Yes.
All right. So I just want to say for any Janet Jackson fans out there that I refer to Janet, the album that came out in the early 1990s, as Janet Jackson's third album. I am well aware that it is not her actual third album because she had 2 albums early on in her career, but considering Control was her major breakthrough, major label debut, it is widely considered that Control is her first album. And then she had Rhythm Nation, 1814, and then Janet. It's kind of like Alanis Morissette. A lot of people think that Jagged Little Pill is actually her first album, when really it's her third album. But her first 2 albums only came out in Canada.
Limited release.
Yes, that's right. So I just wanted to say I love Janet Jackson. I mean, she deserves all the flowers that she gets. So 100% I know that Janet is not her third, but it's her 5th album. Then I've got another one that I guess is bigger because we're tackling the issue of me calling myself a white cis or a cis white male in the previous episode. I am Armenian, as you have, I mean, it is said in the introduction of our podcast that I'm French Armenian, so ethnicity Armenian. Armenians defining themselves in terms of race has always been a biggie. I'm not going to lie. It's what you consider yourself to be. It's what other people consider you to be. And it's also, it's a very relative to others kind of thing. So I don't want to elaborate on that too much because it is also something quite personal. But yes, so I went and did some research, and people widely consider Armenians to be white, which is why I called myself a cis white male.
Interesting, isn't it? And we'll talk about culture and perceptions a little bit in this podcast.
Absolutely.
Mm.
And considering we have very many Armenians in the public forum, including Kim Kardashian, we definitely will tackle the concepts that Kim Kardashian is known for at one
Yes.
point, right? The concept of family and so many others. So we're very
Exactly.
excited about that as well.
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
So
Well,
stay
thank you.
tuned.
Stay tuned. Well, I'm just fact checking my own fact check actually before I say it. So my first one was that the last week or in the last episode, I talked about Blur and Oasis, and I referred to them as Britpop. And afterwards, I thought, oh my, no, it was Cool Britannia I was
Mhm,
referencing. But I have since looked it up, and they were called Britpop, and Britpop actually led into Cool Britannia. When I think of
mhm.
pop music, I don't think of Blur and Oasis in that kind of Spice Girls Britpop sense. So I did actually, while I guess I am technically correct, I actually was wanting to refer to the period of music called Cool Britannia in Britain.
And that's a very interesting one because I mean, I grew up in that era, absolutely loved anything that came out of the UK in terms of music at that time. I never really considered Blur and Oasis to be doing the same kind of music. You know,
Correct.
more often than not, I found that their sounds were quite different.
Yes, and there's an excellent Billboard podcast that actually looks at that period of Blur and Oasis, and
Hmm.
actually also looks at why they didn't make it big in America and the cultural setting of why they were so big in the UK. But it also talks about where they came from, and that one group were from working class kind of backgrounds, the other one almost pretended to be from working class backgrounds. So it's I can highly recommend that Billboard podcast. My second one, when I was talking about Fast Car and Tracy Chapman and the sort of accidental crossover star, and of course I said Luke Combs instead of Luke Combs. You did correct me very delicately, I noticed in the podcast because you replied to me with Luke Combs. But I just want to point out for any Luke Combs fans, I do realize it is just one O in Luke Combs. So they're my little, I'm sure there's plenty of others. So, this is just a little, the highlights that we felt we needed to correct in about last time.
That's right. And I need to go back to about first time to our first episode that was Taylor Swift
Yes.
based, tailor made. And I really wanted to go back to that because, I mean, the album's out. We've seen the reviews, we've seen the fans, we've seen the very different opinions about this record. Without going to the actual opinions about the record and how I feel about the record, I just wanted to go back to, because it is what we do in this podcast, is look at things through the lens of a journalist and a PR specialist. As a journalist, I was actually quite shocked to see some comments in reaction to some reviews that came out that fans deemed weren't positive enough and were not only having a go at the review, but having a go at the journalist, not for having voiced an opinion, but for being a journalist and for writing for whatever publication that is, and also having a go at the publication. Now, I, as a journalist, respect very few things more than freedom of the press. I find that it is my place to say, absolutely, you can disagree with the review. You can be critical of the line of reporting of some publications, but I don't think there was anything in those reviews that were negative in a way that would ever justify some of the reactions that I saw. And just to bring some context to this whole thing, let's go back to Reporters Without Borders 2023 report revealing that 45 journalists were killed in line with their work in 2023 worldwide. It is the lowest total since 2002, but it's still 45 too many. And the report also revealed the number of journalists that were held hostage. That's 54, 84 who remain missing, 521 at the time of the report coming out who were detained. And I just want to say that it is very important to measure our reactions, bearing in mind that there are journalists who actually are killed in line with their work. So I guess let's chill and let's respect everyone's opinions and enjoy the music if we do and not listen to it if we don't.
Absolutely. And I mean, you know, freedom of the press we've talked about is a big thing. And we certainly know the danger that a lot of journalists put themselves in certain countries and in certain situations. With regards to journalists being maybe pursued online by Taylor fans, I actually think that is part and parcel of being a journalist of a certain genre. If you look at sports reporters, particularly in football, but you know, fan allegiance here, and I can think of some journalists here in Australian rules football that certainly get attacked for their opinions. And I actually think, you know, if I guess it's with this podcast, if you can't hack it, don't put it out there. I think it's very different to be attacked for an opinion as opposed to being a journalist in a dangerous situation,
I
or in a situation where there is state-run media and political censorship. I think is very different to them being pursued by fans who might not like your opinion.
I agree, but when you reach a point where some publications decide not to publish the name of the person who wrote the article for fear of retaliation, obviously it means that things are being taken seriously enough that there seems to be a danger there. So obviously, all these opinions are somewhere on the spectrum of the freedom of press and how we are, how we position ourselves when it comes to the freedom of the press. But yeah, absolutely valid point as well.
And it'd be interesting to maybe in another episode to talk about, you know, who is like the publication, who are they scared of by publishing the journo's name? You know, like where is the pressure come?
Mhm.
Because that's a lot of power they're putting in the fans. Are they actually scared of, you know, certain record labels or long-term kind of relationships and access to these stars? If I make a bad
Yes,
review of your album, I don't get access to you for an interview. I don't know. So that might be one to debate in the future.
of course. And I'm sure it happens.
Yeah.
Absolutely. People
Oh,
walking on
I think we
eggshells.
know that some get, you know, crossed off the Christmas card list.
Probably. That's a good list, that one. Yeah, so we're going to leave it at that. I
Yes,
think, we'll tackle more issues like these as they develop. So stay tuned,
exactly.
dear listeners. All right, we're gonna jump into the topic of the week. But before we do, I would actually very much like to dedicate this episode to the memory of a friend of ours, Craig Puranan Wilson. We lost Craig a few years ago in 2018, and it so happened that you and I were together when I got the news one morning. We were in Australia together. And I just wanted to dedicate this episode to the memory of Craig because not only did he have a wicked sense of humor, which is what we're going to talk about today, but he is also one of the first people I worked with in the events industry at the Sydney Olympics in 2000, where you were as well. We were actually in the same venue without even knowing each other at the main press center of the Sydney Olympic Park. And yeah, just want to say, some people just leave a mark in your life and in your psyche and especially when it comes to some things. And we worked with him in Qatar as well in 2006. He
We
was
did.
my movie theater buddy, and we had these remote venues that required driving in the desert for
Yes.
a long time. So that's when, and because that's how our friendship developed as well. That's where conversations happen and jokes fly, and you have the time of your life, basically.
Exactly. And I must have known Craig at the Sydney Olympics, but didn't have a huge, well, I mean, it was all a bit of a blur. But I remember sitting in the airport lounge in London to fly out to Doha for the Asian Games. didn't know. I knew a few people who were already out in Doha, but you're always a little bit anxious before you head off to your next event gig. And I remember sitting in the airport lounge and this guy coming up and talking to me and saying, "Oh, you're going to Doha," and it was Craig, and he'd sort of
Mm,
recognised me from the Olympics, and because we worked in the same venue, and we had a good chat, and there was a warmth, and as you say, he had an amazing sense of humour, and it was so nice to then be hopping on a plane with someone that you knew, and then getting off at the other end, going through customs, getting that excitement, getting to the media
right.
accommodation. So and of course, our venues were closely linked in a very weird way in Doha. So we got to hang out with Craig a lot, and of course you worked closely with him, and it's an honor to dedicate this episode to him.
All right. I think we said everything. Thinking of Craig today and going into our topic, the
Yes.
injunction to laugh, comedy, the
Yeah.
injunction to laugh. That's a big one, isn't it?
It is. And here's something you might not know about me. I worked in the comedy department at Granada Television in London when I worked in London.
Oh, wow. Well, I must have known this, but
I
do
don't know
say
whether
a
you
bit
did.
more.
Well, I went in for, I think, 2 weeks temping
Hmm.
and stayed 6 months. And the only reason it was cut short is I actually came back to the Sydney Olympics. So, and in fact, one of my favorite comedies that briefly reappeared on a streaming service in Australia, but seems to have disappeared again, The Royal Family, set in Manchester, which I'd like to talk about at some stage today, was actually being made at the time I was there. So, Cold
Hmm.
Feet was a series that was coming out there. The Royal Family, a range of others, and it was fascinating working in a department. And one of my jobs was to log all the cold scripts that people sent in, and
Wow.
I had to send them a letter to say thank you. Your script has been received. It'll be passed on to one of our script writers, and we did pass them on to the script writers, and they did read them, which I was really
Good to
impressed with.
know.
And
Right?
I thought, good on these people. And some people it would just be a couple of bits of paper. Some people it was almost like lever arch binders full of potential scripts. So, and I always, got excited thinking, oh, they'll get this letter in the post saying, their script has been received by Granada Television. And yeah, there we go.
Lovely.
And
Hmm.
it was in the London Television Tower we were based. So on
Cold
South Bank.
Feet. Cold
Yes.
Feet. Was that the one with, was Helen Baxendale in Cold
Yes, she
Feet?
was. Yes.
Oh, I have a Helen
Ah,
Baxendale
hey.
story coming up.
That could have been your segue to your exciting story. So yes, Helen Baxendale, Hermione Norris, uh, James Nesbitt. I'm trying to think who else. So,
Hmm.
and it was so weird because I had just arrived in London, and I remember watching the show. Like I was staying at a youth hostel before I found somewhere to live, and it was sort of the show at the time. And then going in,
Yeah.
and next minute I was working in the department that made the show and working alongside the producer and the production manager and the scriptwriter. It was quite surreal.
Fascinating.
You don't sound convinced.
No, no, it is fascinating. No, absolutely. I'm all for these kinds of stories. We're still finding out stuff about each other. I find
Exactly.
that incredible. Well, I mean, we are friends and we do agree on a lot of things, but certainly the idea for this episode came from us not really agreeing on something. And I
Exactly.
think we have very different opinions
Yes.
about what constitutes comedy that we respond positively to.
Yes.
And we've shared our favorite shows and favorite comedians and favorite comedies in ever since I've known you, we've been talking about this. And there seems to be one that we never really got to agree on, and pretty much why we're having this episode,
Mm,
which is our disagreement on one of the most popular television shows of all time, which is Seinfeld. Now,
exactly.
before that's right, before we jump into this, I think that this is one of those topics that is very cultural in terms of where we come from, in terms of our culture and what constitutes comedy in our respective cultures, bearing in mind that I was born and raised in France and you in Australia.
Yes. Yeah. And I was thinking about that. And of course, it's quite timely actually because Curb Your Enthusiasm, the Larry David series, has just wrapped
Yes.
I'm very late to the party on that one, and have only just started watching it in sort of the week the last episode aired. And of course, Larry David being one of the co-writers of and um, creators of Seinfeld. Um, I mean, I remember when Seinfeld came out here, it was incredibly new. And, they kept calling it the show about nothing, which, of
Mm-hmm.
course, it's not a show about nothing because there is a storyline to every episode. Um, but it was unlike anything we had had before. So I don't know whether culturally Australia had been prepared for a show like this. But I always found it interesting that, Seinfeld was incredibly popular here, obviously popular in America. It always surprised me, and we would, being in Australia, you'd often meet English backpackers that they had never watched an episode of Seinfeld, yet they had watched every episode of Friends, because Friends just, and we'll talk about Friends in a moment, seem to be played over
Yes.
and over again. So culturally, I'm not, it's interesting. And I'm keen to know why it didn't resonate in France. Was it not promoted? Was it not put on main distribution? How was it?
So
Was it not given access, or was it just not received well?
So first of all, what we have to say about French television is that we have very few ad breaks. So if a sitcom is 17 minutes, chances are, if you tune in too late, you will have missed 9 minutes of the episode, and the episode will almost be over. So we only had like one ad break in the in on French television whenever a sitcom aired. The second thing is that we don't have a huge history of embracing American sitcoms.
Mm.
The ones that we actually did embrace in France from the United States were, as far as I can remember, Who's the Boss,
Mm-hmm.
and then The Cosby Show.
Yes.
And there was only one channel that actually aired these sitcoms on primetime television, and that was M6, which is Channel 6, basically. And they used to air Who's the Boss and The Cosby Show at 8 p.m. So whenever one was on, the other wasn't. And then when Friends came out, we were just starting out with cable television, and Friends was actually a cable show. Now, it aired on cable in France, and I remember I'd spent the summer of 1995 in the States, went back to France for my senior year of high school, and I remember the day the first episode of Friends aired in France because I'd heard about it in the States but had never caught an episode. But I knew it was all the rage. So when I found out that Friends was going to be on, I actually tuned in. I vividly remember the scene. I pulled an armchair as close as I could to the TV because my mom had fallen asleep on the couch and I didn't want to wake her up. So I was super close to the screen, and they used to air two episodes back to back. So I watched episode 1 and 2 of Friends. And as weeks and months went on, my mom started watching with me. My sister started watching
I
with me.
thought you
So
were
it
going to
became
say. I thought you were going to say your mum woke up.
well, she did. She did absolutely. And then she started watching with me because there was only one TV set in the house. So if you wanted to watch television, then you had to be in
Mm.
the living room. So we actually it kind of became this family moment. I don't really know why Seinfeld didn't pick up and Friends did, because they aired on the same channel pretty much in the same time slots. I think there is something very different to the kind of comedy that Jerry Seinfeld uh, provides in Seinfeld
Yes.
uh, than the kind that we were used to in France. I would call what Seinfeld did observational humor, and I'm only talking about the comedy segments in the show. I'm not
Yes.
talking about the entire episode. So
Yes.
that to me was observational humor. Someone standing up on stage as themselves and commenting on a certain number of things that they've witnessed in the world and in real life.
Mm.
In France, stand-up comedy is more someone standing on stage and kind of providing the same kind of observations but through characters. It's
Yes.
only very recently that a stand-up comedian actually just speaks on stage as themselves. So I
Yes.
think that because we were used to that kind, Seinfeld didn't really pick up, and I think there was much more of an identification possibility with Friends, because it was called Friends.
Mm.
Very generic term that you can actually tap into and take what you want. whereas Seinfeld was called Seinfeld. So it really was just the person.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I. It's funny, isn't it? I don't. When I think of comedies, I actually don't think of Friends as a comedy. I think I just think of
Mm.
it as a series. And even when you said "Who's the Boss," which of course it's a sitcom, but I don't think of those as comedies. I think I just think of them as series. With Seinfeld, I think of it as a comedy.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps because it's come from a comedian. And even when you were talking, I was having some very what's the word? I was having some quite biased thoughts, and I'll say it because, and don't hate me for it, because I love Friends, and I think Friends is like, I mean, we know there's issues with how Friends has dated, and we might even tap into that, as in how it has dated in the era of when it was made, and how it comes across now. I
Right.
think Friends is like a big warm hug. It's
Mm-hmm.
easy, it's accessible. I think Seinfeld was far more. It was a clever show, and
Right.
and I know that is, there is a whole um, hierarchy and sort of snobbiness to comedy, which we might touch on. So I know that's a terrible thing to say. So that is in no disrespect to Friends, but it is, it's not unlike other formats. Whereas I think Seinfeld was so groundbreaking at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we hadn't had shows where a comedian stood up at the front and did a little, at the start, and did a little stand up. But I don't know, maybe Seinfeld is actually I don't know, this could be a stretch, a little bit more like some of the British shows we had grown up with. It's not
Mm-hmm.
as obvious as in your face, as some of those other American shows. And I'm not going to talk for all of Australia, obviously, but in our household, we definitely, I mean, we had Family Ties, and we had The Cosby Show, and Who's the Boss, and Growing Pains, those kind of shows. The Brady Bunch, I guess you'd call that a sitcom.
Right.
But we certainly our family watched a lot more from England.
Mm-hmm.
The Two Ronnies, The Goodies, Faulty Towers, Porridge, Open All Hours, To the Manor Born, The Good Life, all of those shows. So I don't know.
Right.
I think maybe for me, Seinfeld feels a bit more, even though obviously it's set in New York, a little bit more those English shows that we had grown up on.
Well, that's a very interesting observation. We didn't get a lot of, interestingly, we were, you know, really close to the UK, yet got really few British shows on French television. I think the only comedy we ever got was Benny Hill, which aired on Sunday evenings, which I have a whole heap of opinions about because I found the humor to be so mean in that show.
Mm.
And I never really responded positively to that show, but I still feel, and I think that the one that I would compare Seinfeld to in a more recent years is The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, which I think is an incredible, amazing show. And I've actually had this conversation with a few people that I find the writing to be impeccable. The visual aspect of the show is absolutely amazing. Um, the segments of the show that I respond to the least positively are the stand-up segments that Midge does in the show because it just doesn't make me laugh. And I know that laughing is something so personal, but that kind of observational, and then I look at people cracking up, and that's why we decided to call this the injunction to
Mm.
laugh. Because the question is, should you be laughing when everyone else is if you don't find something funny? So
Yes, and and I haven't watched the Marvelous Mrs. What's her name?
Maisel, the
Maisel.
marvelous
I
Mrs.
was going to call her
Maisel.
Maisie. Maisel. I think there is a difference between a stand-up in a show, and if I think of Shay, the character in Just Like That, um, that
Mm-hmm.
was a comedian. They were a comedian in a show,
Mm-hmm.
and I have always felt terrible for that actor, sorry, because the character, everyone kept saying the character wasn't funny and their comedy wasn't funny, And I do feel for that actor, are they kind of tarnished with an unfunny character? But
Mm-hmm.
that's very different, I think, to Seinfeld, where he set the scene, those opening monologues set the scene for the tone of that episode. So I think it's very, yeah. It's interesting, isn't it, whether you're a stand-up as part of your character in the show, or to me, the Seinfeld kind of sat outside the show, even though, of course, it was Jerry Seinfeld doing the stand-up.
Mm.
But it is interesting, and I was just speaking of Jerry Seinfeld. I love. I've got to get the title right. It's Comedians, Cars, and Coffee, but I think it's Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, where he takes out a new comedian each week in a different style car, and they drive around. And I highly recommend it for anyone who hasn't watched it, because they talk a lot about, with each comedian, what humor is. And
Mm-hmm.
there's one with Ricky Gervais where Ricky Gervais said, I over laugh almost when someone tells me a joke, because I feel bad if I don't laugh. And Jerry
Mm-hmm.
Seinfeld says, well, how arrogant of them to think they can make you laugh, being Ricky Gervais. And
Right.
he said, it's just something I can't not laugh, even if it's not funny, because I feel bad for the person.
I understand. And the fact that you mentioned the character in And Just Like That, and their comedy, and that their persona was going to be tarnished by
Mm.
the fact that that comedy was poorly received, had me think about what Matthew Perry said during the Friends reunion, which really made me think, because he mentioned the fact that, I don't know if it was in the Friends reunion or in another interview, but he mentioned the fact that when a joke that he said during the live taping of Friends didn't land, it felt like the end of the world to him. It
Mm.
felt like a massive kind of failure on his part, and that it really devastated him that a joke wouldn't land. And
Yes.
we know, and we actually know how Friends and all those sitcoms are written, because there are rewrites happening as the reactions of the live taping audience are felt. And if
Yes.
a joke doesn't really land, and the shows are paced in such a way that you actually know when to laugh. And
Yes.
to hear Matthew Perry actually say that it had such a negative impact on him to not get the laugh whenever he thought he was going to get one as per the
Yes.
script, really kind of makes you look at this in a certain way.
Exactly, because if we think up, and we've just had the Melbourne International Comedy Festival here, so I've been to a couple of the shows this year, and love going every year. And it's some of it is cabaret, some of it is quite storytelling comedy, some of it is straight
Yes.
stand up. And I mean, I've certainly been in audiences where I've been dying for the person on stage, because you can tell when they're building up and they land the joke and no one laughs, and they've got to quickly shift and pivot. And I mean, that is brutal in a room of 20 or 50 or 100 or 500 people. um, on a show like Friends, it's brutal because you're putting it out to millions of people. But yes, in
Mm-hmm.
that moment, you're doing a live recording. Your whole rhythm and momentum is based on certain kind of hitting your mark. Almost, if we're thinking of choreography, it's kind of like choreography, that
Right.
they build up to that final move, which is the sort of the punchline. And I'm sure they've rehearsed a little gap there to allow for the laughter from the
Absolutely.
audience, and then you don't get
Mm-hmm.
the laughter from the audience. And I don't know, because I've never been in, I don't know what it's like, because I've never been in the audience of Friends, but I know someone who has been in the audience of the taping of a Friends episode. He joins me right now, all the way from Louisville, Vicken Kakukli.
That's right. Listeners, if you were wondering who'd been to the live taping of an episode of Friends, let me set the scene for you. Yes, I did go to the live taping of an episode of Friends, and I need to tell you, we're talking about the 1990s, when you actually had to call a number to actually get seats for a taping. So here I am in France buying a magazine about Friends, because Friends was really picking up, and I knew I was going to go to the States to visit my grandma, because she lives in California. So I knew my mom and I were going for Christmas. And I thought to myself, how cool would it be to actually go and see the live taping of a show, which was 15 minutes away from my uncle's place. And so I actually called. I called from France. I called the American number and I said, uh, I'm coming at this time of year. And they were like, oh, we only have the one taping because then it's Christmas hiatus.
Mm.
And they were like, but we're already full. And I actually begged the person and said, I'm only coming for this amount of time. I mean, I don't even know what I said.
Because you're the
Long story
only
short,
person traveling in the world at that time.
that's right. Well, you know what? What the worst thing that could have happened was a firm no, and then it ended
Mm,
up being a yes. So,
mm,
if you got to try.
mm.
So I actually did, and then so I got two seats to go watch the episode where Ross meets Emily for the first time. So very pivotal episode in the early years of the show. So here I am with my mom because I dragged my mom to the taping of Friends, and I still tell her today, you have no idea what a significant moment that was that you were able to go
You
watch
should
the
be
live
very
taping of an
grateful.
episode of. No, no gratitude. No, but we were talking, but it actually goes back to the injunction to laugh because here
Mm,
I am sitting in the audience of the show, and you do actually hear some jokes that don't feel that funny that it would get a whole group of people to, burst into laughter. And I did find myself kind of giggling and laughing at things that probably I wouldn't normally do. That
yeah.
what I can tell you though is that seeing the live taping of that episode has ruined it forever for me.
Mm,
I do not see that episode as I see the other episodes because
yes.
I saw the behind the scenes. My mom, bless her, was a great compass for what was funny and was what was not because she wasn't laughing when it wasn't funny. And it was a long, like it's hours and there are long breaks because people have to change. And I don't specifically remember the rewrites, but I do remember a couple of things that changed along the way. And so, yes, I feel that that really kind of justifies the notion, the concept of injunction here, because you're
Yes.
in a place where you are expected to
Yes.
laugh at certain times.
Yes.
And also going back to your experience in London and comedy shows, specifically Cold Feet, that episode was the first episode that Helen Baxendale was in. And when I went to the live taping, I think it was December 1997, the live taping that I saw, the actress who portrayed Emily was not Helen Baxendale. And I've been driving myself crazy for 27 years trying to figure out whether the role was recast or whether it was just a stand-in for that night and then Helen Baxendale taped her scenes at a different time. And I was never able to have an answer. So Helen Baxendale, if you're listening, could you please reach out to us or put in the comment section what the deal is with that
Yes.
specific,
Or if you are the
with that,
actress who, in fact, did play Emily, who
that's
knows?
right.
We
Or
could
if you're Jennifer Aniston
correct. I mean,
and you have the answer.
that's right. Yes.
We'll take an answer from anyone who was there.
Even if it's not
We're good.
true, we'll just take an answer. But you know what? As you were talking about that and that laughter in the audience, it just reminded me that of going to be in the live audience of a show here in Melbourne, which is a quiz show, sort of things that happen during the week. Called "Have You Been Paying Attention?" and it's got comedians on. And I remember, and this was maybe I don't know 6 or 7 years ago, no, maybe a bit longer. The show's still running, but they rang me up and I'd put down that I wanted 4 tickets, and it was almost like I was interviewed to see if I would laugh and if I am. And I'm sure they said to me, and your friend, do your friends really like the show? And what do they like? And it was like we were being auditioned. It was the strangest thing.
Grilled.
It was so bizarre. It was like, it's because it's a tiny, tiny audience. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, so we had this weird sort of interview on the phone, I guess, to see that we'd be a lively audience. And then we
Mhm.
got to the TV station, and it was a Sunday night. And then we all got put in this like a massive sort of meeting room, boardroom, with some with some meeting, like tables in the middle that had sandwiches on. Like, it was so bizarre, and everyone just awkwardly stood around, and we were laughing like, is this like some kind of social experiment? And I think there might have been there might have been wine. I feel like there might have been wine, but it was like 4 or 5 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. So yes, sandwiches. It was like, if we were all single, it would have been the most awkward single dating kind of thing. And then we all
Wow.
got, I think we got a name badge, and there were like 3 colors, I remember, with the highlighters. And then they put us in order. So they had worked out, it was like we were in, I mean,
In order of what?
well, how we sat. So they must have observed. I mean, it was, look, we came up with all these scenarios of why we were in this room, and we were like, there was 2-way mirrors and we were being watched. But it might have actually been to do with how tall we were, or diversity, because no one sees the audience.
Did they break down the groups and you ended up not sitting
Yes,
with your
because when they
friends?
got you to line up, we could see you were sort of lined up with the color highlighter group that you had been marked. There'd probably only be maybe like 50 people, 100 people in this audience. It's a tiny little audience. Or it
Right.
might have meant absolutely nothing. It might have just been what time, when we registered, like, or that we were a group of 2 or a group of 4, but our minds were, going crazy. But it was more the phone call where I felt like I was being auditioned to be in the audience, and that they really wanted to make sure they had an audience that would laugh and that did like the joke, did like the show, and perhaps weren't being dragged along because their partner liked the show. They
Did
wanted
you?
people who kind of got the humor in the show.
Did you like the show? Did you
Oh,
laugh?
yeah. I mean, we love the show, and it was hilarious. But once again, it's ruined us for the taping, for watching it,
Right.
because we see what goes on behind the scenes, and how the
Hmm.
editing really works, sort of thing. And not that it changes really much of the show, but we saw not every question and joke gets in the final show. But it was just as funny live as it was when we watch it on TV.
Should we tell maybe our dear listeners where shows are taped in Australia? Because that's something not a lot of people know. So is it mostly taped in Melbourne? Is it a split between Melbourne and Sydney, all those television shows, or?
Yes, I'd say it's split between Melbourne and Sydney. Yeah.
Okay,
And
very interesting.
it's not all shows are set in Melbourne and Sydney.
Hmm.
Well, it depends. A studio show would predominantly be set in Melbourne
Yes,
or
that was
Sydney.
my question. Hmm.
Other shows aren't, but that's a really interesting one, because I was reading when we were talking about this episode, there was a line that really stuck in my head from a podcast I'd listened to Ashton Kutcher on. And I'll
Right.
preface this by saying I have not watched The Ranch. So The Ranch is a sitcom that he pitched to Netflix, and he talks about why he pitched to Netflix, because he didn't want to be constrained by those kind of parameters that you are on commercial TV, that it has to be this many minutes, it has to
Right.
have this laugh track, sort of thing.
Hmm.
Um, and the podcast, and I need to go back and listen to the episode. I feel like he said that the reason he did The Ranch is there are not many sitcom, or there's no shows for a certain audience, like whether it's a Republican audience,
Hmm.
and how important that is. And I went and was looking that up before we jumped on today, and I did find an article where he said in America, shows are either West Coast or East Coast. With the exception of probably Roseanne, set in Illinois,
Right.
probably that 70s show set in Wisconsin.
Hmm.
And I'm not going to talk about like Dallas and Dynasty. We're sort of talking about sitcoms.
Right.
Very few shows are aimed or represent the heartland of America, which is the reason he was. And look, there's varying opinions on the Ranch. I've read some very interesting reviews. I've never watched it, but I thought it was just really interesting, that concept of and obviously happy, we could talk about Happy Days and Laverne and Shirley aren't West Coast or East Coast, but at
Right.
the moment, there's very few shows that are not set in California or New York.
That's true.
And
That's true.
correct, exactly. And so I thought that was really interesting, because, and then it got me thinking about his previous comment around, if you are a right-wing Republican, what shows do you go to? Because I think in the entertainment and creative industry, they are all a bit left leaning. They're all a bit
Yes.
liberal. Perhaps I should say liberal, not left leaning. They are more liberal. So I thought that was a really interesting thing because I think we do, there's audiences that are left behind. And I did read, though, that, Parks and Recreation, which obviously is filmed, and like The Office, set in Scranton, they're filmed in California. Parks and Recreation is filmed in California. But they said it's, one of the few shows that is set in sort of small town America, but doesn't make fun of small town America, actually celebrates the warmth and the friendship and that
Hmm.
environment of small town America. So I think that's really interesting too, is, which audiences, and so when you're asking me that question of Melbourne and Sydney, if you live in country New South Wales, what shows can you relate to? I'm not saying you can't relate to obviously Melbourne and Sydney ones, but I do think we can get quite major city or major state centric.
Because shows actually feel that they have to have this aspirational component to them and portray life in places that are, that people aspire to be in. And that's a very interesting point that you raise, because I live in Louisville in Kentucky, and I don't know if you've ever seen this show. It's called Call Me Kat. It is Mayim
Oh,
Bialik's sitcom that she did after The Big Bang Theory wrapped, and that was produced by Jim Parsons with Mayim Bialik as producer, and that is the American version of
Miranda.
uh, Miranda.
Yes.
Absolutely.
We have
And
talked
so
about
the
this because I
show,
love Miranda. I hate
yes,
Call Me Cat.
the show takes place in Louisville.
Mm,
The show takes place in Louisville, and I mean, they pronounce Louisville correctly. So that's, that's a good thing. But, watching the show, it never occurred to me that this was an accurate representation of the city that I've lived in for 2 years,
yes. Yes.
So I'm thinking how accurate a representation of the place where the scene takes place do we expect a comedy show to be?
Yes. Yes.
So
And
it's
that's really interesting, isn't it? Because with comedy, I think there's comedy, like when I think of the comedy shows, there's shows that you like because you understand the references and the
right.
representation. There's a
Hmm.
show in Australia called Utopia that is set in an offshoot of the public service, and I mean, it's like they have ears in any office in Melbourne. It's
Yes.
just, down to, I mean, there's a hilarious episode where they're doing I think it's pre kind of Zoom. It could be doing like a Google hangout meetup, whatever, and someone can't get on, so they onto the virtual meeting, so they have to ring them on their
Right.
phone and have them on loudspeaker. So we love it. For some people, they can't watch it because it's too close to the bone, but you can see yourself in it, and it's very representational, and
Hmm.
the humor is hilarious because it is so spot on every detail. But then there's other shows that you watch, like Parks and Recreation. I've never worked in small town government, To the Manor Born. I've never lived in, country England, on a
Right.
property, or, a grounds where there's a manor. So then there's comedy that you don't have any references to the context it's set in. But obviously there must be enough references in the jokes that it can be accessed, whether you're from that world or not.
For a show like Roseanne, obviously, because it is about the difficulties that the lower working class is facing. Obviously, you have to be careful where you set the scene. For
Mm,
example, for The Big Bang Theory, they live in Pasadena, and
correct.
apart from the reference to the Armenian neighbor every once in a while, that may well be my grandmother, because my grandmother lives in Pasadena in California. You don't really feel, I mean, you could be anywhere else. You don't really feel that
Correct.
it's a Pasadena show, or you don't
Exactly.
really feel that Friends. I mean, maybe so much is being said about the New York lifestyle that maybe
Yes.
Friends had more of a New York component or a New York feel to it.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting. I think that sometimes if you feel like Sex and the City always referred to as New York City as a character
Yes.
on the show, obviously for a show that took place outside most of the time, yes. For a sitcom that takes place on a lot in California, in Los Angeles, different story. But to kind of wrap up the topic of Friends, and because
Mm,
we've seen over the past few years videos on YouTube, and you briefly mentioned that about some jokes that wouldn't fly today or wouldn't land today. Friends recaps on YouTube. I don't know if you've seen any of them of jokes that actually
mm.
wouldn't land today because they were insensitive or because they kind of went too far or they were too borderline and that we would probably think twice. And
Yes,
certainly I do find some of these moments a bit cringe. I used
yes,
to look at them, I used to look at them from a different lens in where I was in terms of how I identified and
yes.
where I stood, from certain cultures. And I almost feel like we're very close to having disclaimers before shows saying this show was taped in the 1990s.
Mm,
The kind of humor that flew back then doesn't fly anymore. We are well aware of that, but it kind of represents a moment in culture, and
yeah,
we're bringing it to you. But be mindful that we are well aware that some of these jokes wouldn't fly today.
exactly. Oh, absolutely. And I read an article recently because I don't know why Sex and the City must be coming to a certain streaming service, and the whole article was how is the current younger generation going to respond to Sex and the City, because we know it has been called out for its lack of diversity and some stereotypes and things. But what the article said was, to put that aside, you cannot take it was still an incredibly progressive show at the time. So I think it's very
Right,
easy to attack a show for its what we would say political incorrectness now. But at the time, and when we think about Friends, and I know, there's jokes in Friends that you watch now and you go, oh. And there's certainly some English shows. I mean, there used to be a show called Love Thy Neighbor, which is
Little
the
Britain as well.
Little Britain, which is the most racist show. It's a white English family living. The wife's not racist. The husband is incredibly racist, living next to a family of Caribbean descent. And, it's just appalling. And then there was another show called Mind Your Language that ran for 4 years. It started in 1977. I can remember watching this. It was set in an English language school with an English teacher, young male teacher, and then they had every racial stereotype in the class. So you had, I think, the Austrian girl with the plaits. You had the Japanese person who had a camera around their neck. You had the Italian character who wore a pinstripe suit. I think he could have even carried a violin case. You had the Indian character who would say 1,000 apologies. In this like it could not have been more stereotype and racist. And I've always thought about that show because, I mean, at the time, it was the joke. There was some, if you took away the stereotypes, there were some funny jokes in it, but it was very stereotypical. And I was thinking
Hmm.
that, I've always thought, gosh, Mind Your Language will never get a rerun anywhere. And I was reading about it recently because I've always thought, oh, well, that was a show that felt it was okay at the time. And I think that's a reflection of society at the time. So I think rather than calling out these shows for being inappropriate at the time, I think we actually have to call out society at that time.
Hmm.
But I read recently that even the commissioner of the show, 6 years after the show, said, at the time I felt it should never have run that show. So, that's really different because at the time they realized it was racist and inappropriate. And another article said, well, it was the first time so much diversity had been shown of cultures had been shown on the screen at one time. It was pretty much in the most hideous form of stereotypes. But I found that
Right.
fascinating because I've always thought, oh, well, that's a show that didn't date well. But at the time they felt it perhaps shouldn't have run,
Yes.
when I read that was a huge thing because, and then it sort of took me to, there's a comedian and influencer that I've followed on social media who's brought out a book. And in the book, she must say I think she says one of her kids was throwing a paddy. Now, I've never heard that term. It's not something we say in Australia. And then she did a whole series of Instagram stories about someone responding to that. And basically, someone had messaged her and said, and she screen grabbed the message so we could see it. And I thought it was actually a very measured message. And she said, oh, I'm loving your book, but I'm not sure if you realize the history of where throwing a paddy comes from. And it's actually can date back to sort of the oppression of the Irish by the English. And
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually a really derogatory term with
Mm-hmm.
very, strong racial context. And I thought the best way she could have responded to that is, oh, wow, I didn't know the context of that joke. Thank you for making me aware of it. She did the absolute opposite. And she went on an absolute rant about sort of woke culture. And then she started, posting Ricky Gervais quotes. Um, and I feel that maybe if she had taken a couple of weeks to just sit on that message and have a think about it, because I think it was a
Right.
really missed opportunity to educate us on the context of some of these. And this
Of
whole
course.
concept, and of course she then brought up the Ricky Gervais thing of, basically, sorry if you're offended, but just walk out of the show kind of thing. If you don't
Mm-mm.
like it, turn it off, which is fine. But we certainly know there are certain words and there are certain topics that are no-go places. So
Right.
if your whole thing is, well, if you don't like what I say, don't listen, that
Mm-hmm.
actually doesn't fly, because you do self-censor yourself by not saying certain words. And if I think of, the N word, you would, if that came up in comedy, I mean, it just doesn't happen. So I kind of thought, oh, that's a real cop out to sort of go to
Right.
that sort of political correctness, because we do know there are topics you will not touch with a 10-foot pole. And I thought from a PR point of view, she really missed an opportunity to acknowledge the comment, acknowledge that she didn't know the context. I didn't know the context of that comment.
Right.
But instead, I think she, her reaction was really disappointing.
Closer, absolutely, and closer to Australia. I had a similar encounter, let's say, in my life with the word wog,
Mm.
WOG, which is used in Australia as, I mean, and maybe it's not anymore. I haven't lived in Australia in many
Mm.
years. So when I was living in Australia, the movie The Wog Boy was all the rage, and the comedy about people of Mediterranean origins living in Australia, right? And so I
Yes.
was just and my master's thesis at university, stepping away from comedy for just a minute, was in translation sciences
Mm.
and translation studies. And my focus was Loaded, the book by Christos Tsiolkas that became the movie Head On. And the word wog is said dozens of times in that book as a way in which the main character actually portrays or views himself.
Yes.
So, but then in the United Kingdom, that word, which I'm not going to say anymore because I said it in an Australian context, but I won't say it in a
Yes.
British context, means something completely different. And I had to be educated about that because I'd
Yes.
never encountered, having never lived in the United Kingdom, I'd never encountered that word in a different context than the
Yes.
Australian context.
But,
So I absolutely, and then I spoke with the person that wanted to educate me about it.
mm,
I explained to them the context that I knew the word in and
yes.
how it was felt in that specific context,
Yes.
profusely apologized if I'd offended anyone or her,
Yes.
and, definitely said that I would be more careful with it, specifically on socials or
Yes.
in the ways in which I would use it.
Yes. Oh gosh, that makes me think of something I've always been really interested in, and is about whose story is it to tell. So wog
Mm-hmm.
is a derogatory term in Australia. If unless I think you are a wog. And I
I
say
am.
that because there was a show that a sort of a group of comedians that did a show called Wogs Out of Work, and they were Greeks and
Yes.
Italians, and then that moved into Acropolis Now, which was a sitcom
Mm-hmm.
with
Right.
very stereotype, particularly from the Greek community, but it was told by Greeks.
And
And so
like
what role then, it's that whose story is it to tell? And I can remember sitting in the cinema watching My Big Fat Greek Wedding. And I'm not from, well, my a quarter of my heritage is Macedonian. We don't really know much about it. So I haven't grown up in, a Mediterranean culture in that sense. But I remember sitting in the cinema with a lot of Greeks, and they're laughing at the jokes that wasn't getting.
Hmm.
So, but it's because it was told by a Greek person. So I
And I
think,
agree with you.
yeah,
And likewise, when I was at university in Sydney, UTS, the University of Technology, most of my closest friends were of Mediterranean descent. So Lebanese and Greeks mostly, absolutely. And the number of times that word was,
yes,
I learned from the people that used it and became one of them because I'm from Lebanon and I have
yes,
a Lebanese ID to prove it.
yes,
And, as conversations went on, I got to understand the concept from the inside. And
yes,
then only then did I become educated about the concept from the outside. So you're
yes.
absolutely right when you say, whose story is it to tell?
That's
Because
right.
I was in a position where I kind of owned some of that story myself for being part
Yes,
of that community.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and
Hmm.
you think of, like, we were talking about Roseanne. That's, she could tell that story. Um,
Yes.
and if I think of the Kumars at number 42, which was
Hmm.
in the UK, which was an Indian family. It was sort of a talk show in their house. Lots of references to Indian culture and jokes made around that, but it was their story to tell. And if I go back to the royal family, which I referenced, which was the show being made when I worked at Granada Television, and it's set in Manchester. That is a really groundbreaking show. There is one camera tracking. It is basically set in one room, and it is a family that just sit and watch TV. Now, and there's no live audience and there's no canned laughter. And Carolyn Ahern, one of the co-creators, who has sadly, she's passed away, but an amazing comedy writer and intellect. They said, I've read comedy quotes where they say she was incredibly daft, but incredibly, intelligent. I think she had an IQ sort of off the charts. But they talk about that was her love letter to working class England.
Mm.
She grew up in
Right.
Manchester. It's not a show for everyone. I'll, be very honest about that. But I find it the most beautiful show.
Hmm.
And if I think of a similar show in the sense of, sort of that love letter, is Gavin and Stacey, which is set
Yes.
in Essex and in Barry in Wales, written by James Corden and Ruth Jones. And James Corden dated a girl in Wales. So he always said this fondness of driving over the bridge into Wales to see her family. So, I think there's these shows that are love letters, but then there's other comedy that is written about situations and society and cultures that I think the people who have written it, do they actually have the license? Are we
Hmm.
laughing with people or are we laughing at people? And I think that's a
Yes.
really important point in comedy,
Hmm.
because as there are times when you laugh and you go, oh, I shouldn't have laughed at that, because
Hmm.
by me laughing at that, I've actually given away a lot about myself that maybe I, didn't want to. And I
Yeah.
think back to a cousin's wedding when my sister and I were younger. I don't know, we were probably 13 and 16, or I don't know, 10 and 13 or something. And it was in the era where people would send telegrams, and often they were quite, there was a lot of
Love a telegram.
double entendres, and I remember mum and dad saying, don't laugh at the telegrams because people will know that you understand what they mean.
Ah.
um, but yeah, I think
Well,
there is a lot about whose story it is, but also what you laugh at does give away a lot about yourself.
absolutely, absolutely. And I think that, you were talking about, had we known, or we should have never run that show, we should have never had that
Mm,
show on the air. I mean, imagine people leaving this show with I mean, one of the worst feelings you can feel is the I should have said something or the I should have done something
yes,
feeling. And, having worked on this for most of my adult life of, do something when you feel you should, and
yes,
not don't leave. I mean, we've worked in the event industry together. We've, you witness things, and a lot is being said at the moment about these bubbles where people lose track of what they can say or not say, what they can
yes,
get away with or not, what they can, the behaviors that they can have that can land or not land.
yep,
And I feel, there's something to be said of, if something feels wrong, say it. And at the moment, there's this documentary series airing in the United States about Nickelodeon and the despicable, appalling, terrifying treatment
Mm.
of allegedly some of these children when they were child stars on Nickelodeon, from a viewer's perspective, having the time of their life. And then if you revisit some of those jokes today, for those of our listeners who are based in the US and were able to see the documentary,
Yeah.
I mean, the sexual layers
Yes.
of grossness and
Yep.
it's just terrifying. So, and I feel that, you can actually look at things from the past with a lens of uh, some kind of forgiveness, but not all of it, because some of it was downright, someone should have said something on the spot. You know what I mean?
Correct. Correct. I
Mm-hmm.
think there is, yes, there is a context of that. At the time, I mean, I think it's that thing of the standard you hold is the standard. What is it? That the behavior you allow, sort of thing, is the
Yes.
standard you hold. And I
Mm-hmm.
think there is two sides, because people would have known at the time that was inappropriate. And but then I think there are shows that society, we have evolved and we have learnt more. But I still, there's a lot of and I did actually on a flight recently see that documentary, and I actually read the description and went, that's too heavy for me. Like that, I can't actually watch that at the moment, that Nickelodeon documentary.
Quiet on Set is the
Yeah.
title.
But there is I mean, there's a lot of casual, I mean, casual is such a soft word. There is a lot of, I would say, allowed racism and sexism still in
Mm-hmm.
comedy and in very mainstream loved shows. Now, I'm not going to talk from a racism point of view at the moment, because I'm a white female, so I know there's a lot of racism I wouldn't even perhaps notice it as much as I should. But from a female lens, so something we always hear when we're growing up is, oh, you throw like a girl. It's a real insult to throw like a girl. And
Yeah.
there's an episode of not have you been paying attention? If I Would I Lie to You, which is a show in the UK, which I absolutely love. It is absolutely one of my favorite shows, where you have two panels of three people. They've got to read out a story and they've got to guess if it's true or not. And then it's sort of
Mm-hmm.
that bold, I think it's called Boulder Dash sometimes, this game. There's an episode where Bob Mortimer, his whole thing is, can he split an apple in half with his bare hands? Anyway, they then give him an apple to do, and Rob Brydon, the host, throws the apple, and Lee Max says, oh, and does your husband play too, ma'am? Or something like that. So implying that it was a bad throw, so you must be a woman. And every
Oh,
time I watch that clip, and of course, everyone laughs and all the guys are laughing and they think it's hilarious. But it
yes.
absolutely rolls me up, because it plays into that stereotype of girls can't throw, girls can't play sport. But
Mm-hmm.
no point would any of them, and I don't know if they watched it back now, because it would only be, it might be 5 years old, that clip. Would they go, oh, don't be, you're overreacting, it's just a joke, sort of thing, like that. Or
Mm-hmm.
it's just a joke, don't overreact, which is one of my absolute, don't tell me not to over, like, why can't I have a reaction to this? And I think it goes back to that Taylor Swift comment of, why is our reaction being called out instead of the behavior? So,
Mm-hmm.
in comedy, why is the comedy not being called out instead of the reaction? But anyway, just going back to that kind of, but because it's on a show where everyone's lovely and it is a really funny show, it kind of just gets allowed. So,
But
you,
that's the moment when the I should have said something happens. That
yes,
is the exact moment where the I should have said something happens. And you know what? Even
but I
if
can
the host,
guarantee if you were on that panel, you can't say something,
no, you
because
can't.
you're
But even
breaking
if the
the, yeah,
even if the host actually went to the person in question after the show has ended taping and apologizes to them, that wouldn't fly either. Because if you offend someone, you should apologize to them in the same forum that you offended them in, for everyone to see.
correct.
So, but there's
But
this integrated kind of there's this integrated aspect of what you will allow people to say to you
Yes.
that has a lot to do with you as well, and in not calling, and I'm not and there's no
Uh,
judgment.
No,
We all have to come to terms with that.
yes, but I'm just going to say with this joke, the joke was purely between a group of guys. There were no
Yes.
women involved in the joke. There were women on the panel, but it was
Mm-hmm.
one guy throwing the apple not very well, the other one going, "Oh, and
Right.
madam, does your husband, and does your husband
Yeah.
play too, or something?"
Mm.
So I don't know who they would have apologized to.
But we've always been in situation where we've been the butt of the joke, and
Yes,
kind of, have found ourselves in a situation where you nervously laugh because you don't know what
yes,
else to do because you're caught off guard. And then the person would come to you and apologize, and, behind closed doors.
yes,
And you'd be,
yes,
well, if you feel you've done something wrong, you should apologize to me in the same space and in front of the
mm,
same people that you actually said the joke in. And God knows that, working, I always liken, going back to what we do, what you and I do in our lives professionally. I always liken, a lot is being said about, movie sets and
mm,
television series sets and that Nickelodeon thing on a different level. But these are places where people work really hard, people spend a lot of time together, people are like in a bubble, and everything is heightened. And that's when you lose track of what you can say, what cannot say, get away with, or cannot get away with. And I think it's a very interesting thing.
mm,
Compare, and going back to the comedy and the racism, I think the last kind of humor that we had to shake off as a culture in Friends that wasn't allowed. Well, I mean, there's probably heaps more, but one of the last ones that comes back to us is how were we even able to say jokes like that was colonial humor.
yes,
Because, France was this big colonial empire, and and it kind of ties in with the show that you were mentioning of, allowing yourself to say things about these countries that you
yes,
once had, power over. And, likewise, I was thinking, preparing for this, about some characters that
mm.
wouldn't, full
Oh,
characters that wouldn't, and I'm actually thinking of Chris Lilly's shows. If you think about some of those characters like Jen
oh,
Okasaki, you would never have a Jen Okasaki today.
yeah. Oh my gosh. Jonah in Summer Heights High,
Joe,
you wouldn't have.
apps,
And do you know
no.
what? That's very timely because I was watching a panel show in Australia last night, The Project, and they had the Pet Shop Boys on because they've brought out a new album, which is very exciting. And they
Hmm.
referenced how much they love Chris Lilly. And my immediate thing was, we haven't heard from Chris Lilly for a while
Right.
because I mean, Jonah is basically blackface
Yes.
and I mean, apart from the stereotypes of those Pacific communities, it's stereotypes of learning disability. Well, I mean, that's probably even the wrong word, learning disabilities. But it's um, and that's a fairly recent show. Um,
Yes.
so you're absolutely right. I think Chris Lillian and yeah, I mean, I think there's whole discussions around, I think Chris Lilly is a very clever comedian. I think,
Hmm.
I think I can cope with, I understand some of his characters but yeah, was it his story to tell of a Tongan boy with,
And we're not, and we're
with
really
learning?
just asking, we're really just asking the question here. And
Correct. Yeah.
you know what? With the injunction to laugh, observing all of this comes
Mm,
the injunction to be funny. And
yes.
we'll probably go into these topics at a later date, but think about
Exactly.
people being interviewed in a talk show. If you're, on the couch, well, James Corden doesn't have the show anymore, but if you're on the
Yes.
couch with, a few other people and James Corden's interviewing you, or likewise Graham Norton in the UK,
Yes.
there's the injunction to be funny, to be witty. And
Yes.
as I was preparing, and I want to say this anecdote because it's kind of like, are you laughing at the person? Are you
Yes.
laughing at one trait of their personality? And can you laugh about everything? Is it, can you laugh about everything, or is it, can you
Mm,
laugh about everyone?
yes.
Because there was this anecdote, and I know we very much like Miriam Margolyes, but when she appeared on the Graham Norton show a few years ago, she was talking about how she didn't get nominated for an Oscar because
Oh,
Winona
yes.
Ryder had.
Yes.
And she referred to Winona Ryder as the shoplifter.
Yes.
And everyone burst out laughing. Now, let me just point out that kleptomania is a medical condition, that it's a condition that gets diagnosed. And I was shocked. Also because that also seeps into everyday life. And I was in Australia in tropical North Queensland in Cairns a few years ago. And I was at a store, and to tell people that they had cameras,
Mm,
to actually
mm,
see if people were going to steal, there was a sign with a
mm.
picture of Winona Ryder that said, "We see you, Winona. Shoplifters will be prosecuted." And I actually had a go at them on
Yes,
their socials, going, I am I maybe went a bit overboard because it really, and it just, being a sensitive person, there are other ways to say those
yes.
things.
But I think it's around that. Yeah, is it clever? Is it mean? And I think
It,
female comedians talk about, and I know we're going to hopefully do another show more looking at stand up, because Hannah Gadsby's Netflix special is unbelievable, and actually talks about, and I would say it is a female or perhaps non-binary um, uh, thing of that self-deprecating humor. We feel we've got to. I think it happens a lot more in female comedians. And why do we feel we've got
yeah.
to be self-deprecating to ourselves? But I think
Hmm.
it is that meanness. And I remember
When does,
in the Super, there was an ad in the Super Bowl, and I can't remember who it was for, but in it, someone has an allergic reaction to peanuts, and start like their face starts blowing up. And a friend of mine on Instagram, who I didn't realize had a food allergy. I mean, if you've got a severe food allergy, the result is death if you don't, if it's a severe reaction and you don't have your EpiPen. Like, if you have an anaphylactic reaction, this is very serious. And
hmm
she constantly called out this ad that this having an allergy to food that is really serious is not funny. Now, I probably would have watched that and laughed. The guy's face blows up, and I think back to the Will Smith um, movie Hitch. He has an allergic reaction to shellfish. I think it's a dating movie. He's
yes.
doing some cooking, and then he goes into a supermarket, and he looks in the mirror, and the security mirror, camera mirror, and his head's blown up, and you laugh, sort of thing. But and I saw there was these sort of associations on food allergies really called out this product. I feel it was see I'll have to come back in about last time in our next episode to fact check who it was. But it was really interesting because it really struck a chord with those people. So and it there is a lot that is said, and we're not saying that humor then has to be really clean um
No.
and
When does
sanitized.
joke?
It's just got to be, I think, to me it has to be clever, because I think if you're
Mhm.
clever you don't have to resort to these kind of things. But there's a lot of shows, and that I will preface it by saying they are certainly seen as pushing the boundaries and controversial. And I think of Family Guy, I think of South Park, I think of the Book of Mormon, the musical. Um,
Yes.
and we could even go into the Producers, the musical. That, I mean, when you think of the premise of the Producers around a script to do with Adolf Hitler, I mean, there's whole layers there. But if we look at South Park, Family Guy, and the Book of Mormon, which once again and obviously the Book of Mormon is written by the creators of South Park, and if we could look at Ted, who's a Seth MacFarlane character. We
Yes.
know it's offensive, we know it's boundary pushing, but it's kind of allowed in a sense. But I wonder if
Hmm.
someone did those jokes in a stand-up routine with one person standing on a stage saying basically the jokes are in those shows, how would it be received?
That's a good question, because that also bears the question of, when does joking become bullying?
Yes.
And there's a fine line there. And absolutely. I mean, and we'll get to that in the probably in the stand-up comedy episode,
Mm.
of there are more and more instances of people standing up during stand-up shows and calling out the joke
Yes.
and calling out the joke. So, because bullying is an interesting concept, and I mean, there's more and more portrayals of bullying in popular culture. There's this book called Make Your Bed,
Right.
that actually, Admiral William McRaven, I think is the
Oh,
name.
yes. Yes.
Yeah, so he, Make
Yes.
Your Bed. and there's a very interesting paragraph about bullies, about how they will strike if they see some kind of weakness, and then
Mm.
kind of disguise it as joke. And there's a lot of that happening in terms of whenever people want to rewrite having been offensive or having been bullies or aggressive, the easiest thing to say, the easiest cop out is to say, "Oh, I was joking."
Yes.
But that shows sometimes a real lack of awareness of what you can or cannot say, cannot or cannot do. And I can actually say, if you speak about in the workplace, having worked in so very many different countries over the years, very many different, I mean, most countries are at very different levels of awareness when it comes to those things.
Mm.
I've worked in countries where I got very specific training about what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. And in other countries, it's just, you just show up and kind
Mm.
of go there with your know-how and your common sense,
Mm.
but it's not something that is taught. So I feel there's a
Yes.
very interesting element to be discussed in a further maybe show about stand-up
Yeah.
comedy there.
Because I do think there's some shows on Australian TV that are absolutely loved by everyone. And there's one in
Mm-hmm.
particular I'm thinking that is it's like a panel sort of quiz show. I've referenced it already in this episode. And it is a very funny show. I mean, and it's another show that's like a warm hug, and it has very revered and loved comedians on there. But if you stripped it back, and there's no there's someone on there who's Asian, so there's lots of Asian jokes that get directed at him, and he does, and but he doesn't represent all of Asia. But I think there is a lot of casual racism in that show, and sexism and
Mm-hmm.
comments that is kind of wrapped up because it's a warm show. I don't think they would actually ever be doing anything. They're not bullies, but they're still comedians in a privileged position where
Mm-hmm.
and there's diversity on the panel, absolutely, when it comes to age, race, gender. So but I still watch it and go, oh, we laugh along, and it's a great show. It's no one ever speaks out against it. But if those jokes were made in a different setting,
Yes.
I think they would come across a lot harsher. So I think because it's in the
Mm-hmm.
context of this lovely, warm, funny show, and the comedians often know each other, so there's all, they're all friends. But is it allowed? I don't know. Is there casual racism in that show? Is there casual sexism in that show? Is it allowed? Would it be allowed in a different setting? It's
Yeah.
something I've often asked myself when I watch it.
Mm-hmm. I think, well, I mean, I'm conscious of time and we have heaps
Yes,
more about this topic that is more specific to stand-up comedy. So we'll
yes.
definitely come back to this in a future
And
episode.
and I'd
I
like to
think,
also talk about comedy, because when you were talking about bullying, comedy and bullying of guests on talk shows. I know
and
we've
I
talked
think
about
that,
that in the
and I
past.
think that that would tie in with, absolutely, that would tie in with
Mm.
stand-up comedy, because you kind of feel like a lot of those people in those situations as well were stand-up comedians to begin with. So again, the injunction to be funny at what cost? So, part two coming up soon.
Exactly.
Just to wrap up on this, I think there's more
Yes.
awareness in the media of today,
Yes.
being an observer specifically of that documentary series where they actually went in depth with the whole situation at Nickelodeon, and kind of brought back some of those people from back in the day, and kind of from a place of trying to understand the repercussions on mental health and all those
Yes.
elements. But also Amy Schumer, I think, um, raised an interesting point about comedy and comedians having to be funny all the time, and
Yes.
how whenever she was asked to be featured in a magazine, it was never Amy Schumer the person, it was always Amy Schumer the comedian, and how they would put comics in these ridiculous setups for photo shoots. And she was much more graphic than that, so I'm not going to go
Yes.
into those details.
Yeah.
But I think the media also has difficulty, and it's been changing, because I saw a very interesting interview of Quinta Brunson, who created Abbott Elementary, which is one of the most popular comedies at the moment in the United States, and how they are able to kind of have more down to earth conversations about comedians and comedy writers and
Yes.
not having them be the comic in the newspaper article or in the news piece.
Yeah.
So here's hoping.
Yes. And I just wanted to finish on there's a article from the Guardian last year about the royal family, the show that I've talked about, and I just thought that this was really interesting because someone in the article was saying when the royal family came out, it was such an exciting time culturally for working class people like this person. There was a burgeoning music and comedy scene in Manchester, and poets like him and Lem Sissay could get paid for gigs, finally. And he said in comedy, there was a small community of like minded people: Steve Coogan, who I love, John Thompson,
Mhm.
Craig Cash, Caroline Aherne, the writers, Cash and Aherne being the writers of the royal family. And they said they weren't part of the dying generation of working class comics whose comedy was predicated on prejudice. They didn't belong to the Cambridge set that gave us Monty Python and the Goodies. And then, of course, if we look at Hugh Laurie and Stephen Fry, they came from that very university class. And they weren't part of the comfortable middle class Terry and June suburban sitcom camp. And that these comedians knew they wanted to do something different. So I thought that was really interesting because you do get those pockets of who's not being represented. But I think that, if you think of those that working class comedy really rolls around prejudice in the 60s, 70s, early 80s in the UK.
Right.
So
Well, I
I'd
mean,
like to end on what's your favorite episode of Seinfeld?
you know what? I don't think I can remember one. I know Terry, but I think the one I saw is when, oh, that's an awful one, when George buys the stamps, the envelopes with very cheap
Oh my
glue, and
gosh.
his
Yes.
fiance, yeah.
Yes.
Oh, that's
Yes.
the most awful one. I was Terry Hatcher on Seinfeld? I
It
think she
was.
was.
We
Oh,
could
that
do a
she
whole we could do a whole episode of actresses that played Jerry's girlfriends.
they're
Um,
real and they're spectacular. Is that
Yes,
Terry
I
Hatcher
think so.
saying that?
But
Yeah.
I believe Deborah Messing, Laura Graham, Gilmore Girls. Um,
Wow.
oh yes, we
Is
could
it
we could
Lauren?
actually, that might be a whole episode of
Lauren Graham, isn't
Lauren
it?
Graham. Yes, thank you. You caught me before.
No,
I
okay,
was
so I do
thinking,
know.
I was thinking Lorelai. You see, Lorelai Gilmore. I blended it, and I got the wrong name.
Well done. We forgive you for
Thank
that.
you for
I only
picking me
real
up.
I only realized a few weeks ago that the lady playing the mom, Lorelai's mom on Gilmore Girls, was Baby's mom on Dirty Dancing.
How did you
So,
not know that? I
hmm,
knew
I've
that
never
as
watched Gilmore Girls.
you call you. Oh, okay. Well, that's okay because I was going to say you call yourself a dirty dancing. Well, your sister's a dirty dancing
Hmm.
aficionado, and we may need her on an episode for us to talk about dirty dancing.
We might.
What would you like to wrap up with?
With our pop culture moment of the week, we should do
Oh,
that.
we should
Yes,
do that. Seeing this
absolutely.
is about pop culture.
That's right. So, pop culture moment of the week for me ties in with journalism. I didn't in a million years think that this would happen, that this journalism moment would happen, but Celine Dion is on the cover of French Vogue this month. The magazine came out today in my home country, and my friend's already been to the newsagents to buy me a copy of the magazine, which came out in with two different covers, one in color, one in black and white. Um,
Can
Celine
I ask
Dion.
you what? Is this terrible of me to say that I just assumed she probably had already been on Vogue in France?
No.
Why? Why is that a big thing?
Why is that a big thing? Celine Dion for the French people is, I mean, she's she's everything. She's, you know, her French album Deux, which came out which worldwide is known as the French album, is still the biggest selling French language album of all time around the world. So, I mean, there's something about Celine Dion. She's always been an open book. She's been on a lot of television shows in France. We kind of saw her go. I mean, obviously, Quebec, where she was born, they saw that too. But there's something about Celine Dion and France that is quite special. One of our most gifted songwriters, Jean-Jacques Goldman, came up with most of her early French records from that record on. And just, considering I think people really pull for her, considering what she's been through in the past few
Yes,
months with announcing the condition that she's
yes,
suffering from.
yes.
I think I didn't think that a moment like this would happen where Celine would actually be on the cover of a magazine anytime in the near
Yeah.
future.
So why do you think it
But
hadn't happened earlier?
well, I think that Celine Dion was always considered a very popular singer, but not a
Mhm.
style icon. I mean,
Yes.
people made more fun of her than they
Okay.
actually cheered her on when it
Yes.
came to her fashion. And to be on the cover of Vogue, I mean,
Oh,
if you look
absolutely.
back at if you look back at the suit that she wore backwards at the Oscars, a
Yes.
lot of people, I mean, it's become a moment now, but back in the day, a lot of people were like, what is going on? And what
Yes.
is great with Celine Dion is that she's always owned everything that she's done, the good, the bad, the ugly. She's always owned it. And I was really close to tears when she came out on stage at the Grammy Awards to announce Album of the Year a few weeks ago. Um, and it was, for me, beautiful to see her. I'm still angry at Taylor Swift for not acknowledging her in a better, well, angry. I mean, I still feel that she owed a better a kind of acknowledgement than what she got when she
Well,
was on
we
stage.
yes,
I
and
would I would like to know what the PR specialist at the end of the line thinks of that photo that was posted from backstage afterwards.
well, yes, I'm going to reference. Look, I'm going to stand up for Taylor for two reasons. I think it was chaotic on the stage. I think she had won many albums. No, I know you're not in your head. Hear me out. I think she had won many albums. And yes, look, I do think I have watched it. She does look like she grabs the award and she doesn't pay tribute to Celine. I will go back though and say we looked at the vision of Celine winning that Grammy back in the day. I think
Right.
Sting, and I can't remember who was
Diana Ross.
Diana Ross. And I would say Celine doesn't give them much airtime. So I don't think, anyway, I'm just
Hmm.
going to say that. But I did have a giggle when the photo with Celine and Taylor came up backstage because I could almost feel the PR person running around. I won't say it's Taylor's amazing PR person because I can't remember her name. Um, running around to get that shot, and of course, suddenly that photo is released. I mean, I do feel like Celine had very much been wrangled to be in that photo to show that it's all okay. So I think
Considering,
that
yeah,
I do think damage. I don't know whether damage control would have kicked in at the moment it happened, but they would have been watching the socials, and I think it would have kicked in as soon as the socials hit around it, looking disrespectful that Taylor kind of grabbed the Grammy, and of course we'd
hmm
had Miley Cyrus. Perhaps if we hadn't had Miley Cyrus earlier in the Grammys making quite a point of Mariah Carey being on stage and what a legend, and if she'd made such a she'd given her the presenter being Mariah Carey so much airtime, maybe it wouldn't have been so jolting to see Taylor kind of grab the award.
hmm
Um, so
I
yes, I think that
feel,
the damage control was
yes,
definitely that photo released after. I don't think Celine
yeah.
was hunting out Taylor to take the photo.
And I agree with you. And I do get the point. I mean, Miley being all over Mariah Carey, there's this great video of Jennifer Hudson when she wins her first Grammy,
Mm,
Whitney Houston presenting her. And, Jennifer Hudson being, I mean, being in awe of Whitney
yes.
presenting her the award.
But I do like
And
these shared pop culture moments because I remember when I hunted down the YouTube clip of Celine winning the award, because she talks about when I stood up here and, received the award
yeah.
of so and so.
Hmm.
And I remember finding the clip on YouTube, and the first comment, which was obviously, one of the most recent, but also one of the highest sort of ranked, was, "Is everyone here because of the Grammys tonight?" sort of thing. So, and I
Absolutely.
love those shared pop culture moments where
I know.
everyone has done
Yeah.
exactly what you're doing.
No, absolutely. And it's very interesting to kind of go back to that as well. I think considering what Celine had been through in the past months and how, humble she was when she was on stage, and she was the only one when Celine went up the stage. I mean, she had 25 people, 25 people with her. But I hear
Exactly.
your point. I hear your point as well.
Yes, but I hear
Let's
yours
agree to
too. Yes,
disagree. But
exactly.
yes, Celine had been on the
And
cover of
I still
magazine.
haven't recovered from your Instagram story at the time, which was be a Mariah and be a Miley in a
Liam,
world of Taylors.
that's
And
right.
I remember going, "Oh,
I stand by it, but yeah, no,
fair
absolutely.
enough,
So
fair enough."
Celine had been on the cover of Elle magazine in
Yes.
France, and she'd been on the cover of. Do you have Grazia magazine?
Oh, for a hot minute we did. Yes.
Yes. So I don't think France has it anymore either, but she was on the
I
cover of
think
those,
we
which
did.
were,
I remember buying it in London
mm,
a lot. I feel we
yeah.
may have had it here, but yeah, we
Vogue, I have to say this, and I mean this with love. Vogue is much more a uh, Vogue is much more an iconic magazine than it is a popular magazine.
yes.
I don't think
Yes.
that, I don't think that people are rushing to the newsagents to buy Vogue magazine in
Yep.
France anymore because it's very conceptual as opposed to
Yeah.
other magazines, which are much more pragmatic and giving you tips on your everyday life. This is
Yes.
more, it's almost art now, Vogue magazine in
Yes.
France. So
Yep.
to have Celine Dion on the cover, I think meant a whole lot to a lot of people.
Yes.
Um, what is your pop culture moment of the
Well,
of
my
the
pop
week?
culture moment would have to be the Spice Girls singing. Well, the video, David Beckham filming the video of the
Mm.
Spice Girls singing "Stop Right Now" at Victoria's birthday, which to me it represents so much. I mean, obviously, we love when we see a band or a group that we love together, but to me, it was her 50th birthday, I believe.
Yes,
I haven't
yes.
misaged her. But it actually, to me, was just a group of friends, an enduring friendship.
Hmm.
A group of girls that have been, and women who've been friends for, 30 years, if not more.
Yes.
Just having fun at their friend's birthday party. They weren't on stage; they were just on the dance floor. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm sure that there was no accident that they were going to do a Spice Girls song and it was going to go out on social media. But what I loved is they just looked like they were having fun. It wasn't over Kardashian in its kind of, editing and positioning and curation, I would say. It just, to me, represented female friendship. Or, would be the same if it was, Westlife or Boyzone, or I'm trying to
Hmm.
think of, or Take That. If it would be the same if we saw Take That singing it at Robbie. So perhaps I should just say friendship. To me, it just represented a group of friends having fun. And of course, we loved it because we love whenever the Spice Girls come together.
And I agree with you 100%. So I'm gonna spare you a about last time moment right now. The song is called Stop and not Stop Right Now.
And
So
here's
we won't
an
have to go back.
Thank you, thank you. And here's a tidbit: is that my partner and I actually play this game at home. He might not like me saying this, where we play the film clip, but we don't watch it, and we have to guess whose voice is who singing at any time
Oh,
in the song.
right.
Yes.
Hmm.
And
Look,
I will
it's
say you are not often yelling out posh, posh, because she rarely has a solo.
that is
um,
true. I agree with you, but I think
and it's a
Stop is
very
one of
good
their
film
best
clip. I think
songs. I
it's
love the
an
film clip.
absolute favorite film clip of mine. The styling,
It's
everything
yeah,
about that film clip. Yes.
it's great. The song is so catchy. It's interestingly the only song that they had out that what didn't make it to number one in the UK.
Mm.
It peaked at number two.
It
I think it is an
stopped.
incredibly catchy.
See, it
Yeah, it
stopped
stopped. It
before
stopped
it
at
got.
number two. Absolutely. And for it to be, such a legacy is
And I
great. I
do
love
believe it
that.
is. It is stop with an exclamation mark.
May
Maybe
well
the
be.
title.
My
Um.
record collection is in France. I can't
Okay,
actually
we
go and
can't
check.
verify.
I
But how can you say
thank
that
you for
is
your understanding.
when there's a whole episode there. But it is one of those song titles that I don't think you can just say stop. I have to say stop right now.
Right now,
Thank
that's
you very
right.
much. So
Absolutely.
that would be my pop culture moment. Look at us, we've gone way over, but that's
I
okay.
know. I just want to end. Their hashtag is friendship never ends. I love that. I think it's really
Yeah,
nice. And can
it
I
is.
say, because we've got an episode in there coming up with the topic of feuds and
Yes,
how not only the feuds are, painful to watch, but also how they tarnish what you
yes,
loved years ago and realize that while you were loving what the people were giving you, they were
yes,
having a horrible time putting it together. So it
exactly.
ties
Yes,
in with Quiet on Set, but there's been
yep,
so many feuds in the past few
yes.
years, least one of which is probably Charmed and what's been
Oh,
going on for
that's
25
right.
years.
Yes,
But absolutely, so we'll come back to that, but let's end on
we
this
will.
incredible positive note of the
Yes.
Spice Girls coming back
That's right.
together.
That's my playlist
Hmm.
sorted for today. So thank you for joining us for episode 3. Jump back to our previous episodes if you haven't already listened to them. I'm Georgie Statius, joining you from Melbourne, Australia.
And from Louisville, Kentucky, I'm Vicken Karkukli.
And Vicken's light behaved this time. I see no shadows.
Yeah, work in progress, aren't we
Lovely.
all?
And I've
Mm-hmm.
got a new microphone, so hopefully I don't sound as tinny. Or maybe it's just my voice. Maybe it's not been the
We'll find
mic.
out soon enough, but thank
We'll
you for
find out
tuning
soon.
in, and we will see you next time.
Thank you. Bye. I've got to find the stop record button. Here we go. We'll take it again. Bye.
Bye-bye.
This has been Drop It Like It's Pop.
Be sure to follow us on our Instagram page at Drop Like It's Pop to have access to our latest episodes and playlists.
Until next time.